The morning Daniel Carter was fired, his supervisor smiled as if she had just won a prize. "You're done here," Vanessa Blake said, sliding the termination papers across the desk. Daniel stared at them in silence. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his face calm. He had expected trouble, but not this. Not after 8 years of loyal service. Not after working weekends, staying late, and covering shifts whenever the company needed him. Most importantly, not when he had a 6-year-old daughter waiting for him at home. "Is there a reason?" Daniel finally asked. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "There are plenty of reasons. You've been distracted lately. You leave exactly on time. You've taken too many days off." Daniel swallowed. "My daughter was sick. And that's not my problem," Vanessa replied coldly. "This is a business, Daniel. We need employees who are committed." Daniel looked down at the papers. Every accusation felt unfair, but arguing would not change anything. He signed where he was told. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said quietly. Vanessa laughed under her breath. "You should be thanking me for giving you this much notice." Daniel stood, collected his old coffee mug and a framed picture of his daughter from his desk, and walked toward the door. Behind him, Vanessa turned to her assistant and smiled. Finally. One less problem. Daniel heard her. He paused for half a second, then continued walking. He did not know it yet, but that humiliating moment would soon change the entire company. Outside, Daniel sat in his car and stared at the steering wheel. He had only enough savings to cover rent and groceries for a few weeks. His daughter, Lily, was the center of his world. Her mother had left when Lily was 2, and Daniel had raised her alone ever since. He packed her lunches, helped with homework, braided her hair when she insisted, and worked every hour he could to keep a roof over their heads. He had never complained. He had always believed that if he worked hard enough, eventually life would become easier. But now, sitting in the parking lot with his termination papers beside him, he wondered how he would tell his little girl that Daddy had lost his job. His phone rang. It was Lily. "Daddy?" Her tiny voice immediately softened his heart. "Hey, princess. Are you coming home?" "Of course. Can we have pancakes tonight?" Daniel smiled despite the pain in his chest. "Absolutely. Pancakes tonight." He hung up and wiped his eyes before anyone could see. Meanwhile, inside the office, Vanessa was celebrating. She called several coworkers into her office and ordered coffee and pastries. "We finally got rid of Daniel," she announced proudly. One employee looked uncomfortable. "Was that necessary?" Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Nothing." Vanessa smiled. "Good. Because people like Daniel become liabilities. Always asking for schedule changes, always worrying about his daughter. We need people who put the company first." What Vanessa did not know was that Daniel had been one of the most important employees in the company. He had designed several internal systems, solved major client problems, and quietly prevented expensive mistakes. He never took credit because he believed teamwork mattered more than recognition. That afternoon, Daniel went from company to company carrying his resume. Some rejected him immediately. Others promised to call. By evening, he had received nothing. He returned home carrying a small bag of groceries. Lily ran toward him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Daddy." Daniel hugged her tightly. "How was school?" "Good. I got an A." She proudly showed him her paper. Daniel smiled. "That's my girl." She studied his face. "Why do you look sad?" Daniel hesitated. "Daddy had a difficult day." "Did somebody hurt you?" He laughed softly. "Not exactly." Lily thought for a moment before whispering, "Then tomorrow will be better." Daniel kissed her forehead. I hope so. The next morning, Daniel woke early and began applying for jobs again. He was about to send another resume when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Mr. Carter, a deep voice asked. Yes. This is Richard Hale. Daniel froze. Richard Hale was the founder and CEO of the company he had just been fired from. Yes, sir. Daniel replied. I need to speak with you immediately. Daniel glanced at the clock. Is something wrong? There was a pause. That depends. Where are you? Daniel gave him the address. Stay there. I'm coming. Richard Hale was known throughout the company as a demanding but fair businessman. He had built the organization from a tiny office into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He rarely interfered with routine management decisions, trusting department heads to handle their teams. But that morning, he had received an unexpected report from one of the company's largest clients. The client had complained that a crucial project had suddenly been reassigned and that Daniel Carter was no longer handling it. Richard immediately asked, why? Nobody had a good answer. Then he reviewed the project history and discovered something alarming. Daniel had created the system that kept the entire project running. He had also warned management about a serious security vulnerability 3 months earlier. His warnings had been ignored. Richard called Vanessa into his office. Where is Daniel Carter? Vanessa smiled. He was terminated yesterday. Richard stared at her. Who authorized that? I did. On what grounds? Performance issues. Richard's expression hardened. His performance reports show outstanding results. Vanessa shifted in her chair. He had attendance problems. Richard opened a file. 3 absences in 18 months. All documented emergencies involving his child. Vanessa said nothing. Richard leaned forward. And you fired him without consulting me? I believed it was necessary. Richard stood. You believed? His voice was calm, but the room suddenly felt colder. You believed it was necessary to fire the person responsible for our largest client account? Vanessa's confidence disappeared. I didn't realize, exactly, Richard interrupted. You didn't realize. He picked up the phone. Find Daniel. Now. When Richard arrived at Daniel's small apartment, Daniel was stunned. Mr. Hale? Richard nodded. May I come in? Daniel hesitated before opening the door. Richard looked around at the modest home. A small dining table. A second-hand sofa. Children's drawings covering the refrigerator. Lily peeked around the corner. Daddy, who is that? Daniel smiled. He's my old boss. Richard crouched slightly. Hello, Lily. I'm Richard. Lily smiled shyly. Are you going to give Daddy his job back? Daniel's eyes widened. Richard almost laughed. I certainly hope so. They sat at the table. Richard explained everything. Daniel, I owe you an apology. I should have known what happened. Daniel shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Richard looked directly at him. Yes, I do. You were treated unfairly under my company's name. Daniel remained silent. I want you back, Richard continued. Not only back. I want you leading the department. Daniel looked surprised. Sir, after yesterday, I'm not sure I want to return. Richard nodded. I understand. That's why I'm offering you something different. A promotion, a salary increase, flexible hours, and direct authority over the project you built. Daniel looked toward Lily. Flexible hours? Yes. Richard smiled. No employee should have to choose between being a good parent and being a good professional. Daniel considered the offer. Why are you doing this? Richard answered honestly. Because I made the mistake of assuming my managers were protecting the company. Yesterday I learned that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to watch most carefully. Daniel eventually agreed to return. When they walked into the office together the next morning, the entire building went silent. Vanessa was standing near the reception desk, laughing with two employees. Then she saw Richard. Then she saw Daniel. Her smile vanished. Richard walked straight past her and into the conference room. Everyone, meeting. Now. Employees gathered around the table. Richard stood at the front. Daniel remained beside him. Yesterday, Richard began, one of our most valuable employees was fired without proper review. That decision was made because someone believed personal responsibilities made him less committed to his job. He looked at Vanessa. That was unacceptable. Vanessa's face turned pale. Richard continued. Daniel Carter has served this company with loyalty, intelligence, and integrity. Effective immediately, he will be promoted to Director of Operations. Several employees applauded. Daniel looked uncomfortable with the attention. Richard then announced an internal investigation into the circumstances surrounding his termination. Vanessa tried to speak. Mr. Hale, please, Richard raised his hand. You had your opportunity yesterday. The investigation uncovered more than anyone expected. Vanessa had been manipulating performance records, giving preferred employees better schedules, and blaming Daniel for problems she had caused herself. She had even ignored Daniel's security warning because fixing the issue would have exposed mistakes made by her own department. She had celebrated his firing because she believed no one powerful enough to challenge her cared about him. But Richard cared. And Daniel's story did not end with a promotion. Over the next year, Daniel transformed the department. He introduced flexible scheduling for parents, improved training, and created a mentorship program for younger employees. Productivity increased. Employee turnover dropped. The company gained several major clients. Daniel never forgot the day he had sat in his car wondering how he would feed his daughter. That memory kept him humble. One afternoon, Richard visited Daniel's office. Lily was there doing her homework while waiting for her father. Richard smiled. How's school? Great, Lily said. I want to be a businesswoman like Daddy. Richard laughed. Then you picked a good teacher. Daniel looked at Richard. Thank you. Richard shook his head. You earned it. Daniel smiled. Maybe. But you gave me the chance. Richard looked out the window. No, Daniel. You gave me a lesson. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What lesson? Richard replied, never judge someone's value by how loudly they demand attention. Some of the most important people in an organization are the ones quietly doing their jobs while everyone else is busy taking credit. Years later, the story of Daniel Carter became one of the most repeated stories inside the company. New employees heard how a single father had been fired unfairly and returned as a leader. But Daniel always corrected them. It wasn't about me getting revenge, he would say. It was about being seen. Because sometimes the person you underestimate is the person holding everything together. Sometimes the employee you dismiss is the one your company cannot afford to lose. And sometimes the person you celebrate firing is the very person your boss will ask for the moment everything begins falling apart. Daniel never celebrated Vanessa's downfall. He never demanded an apology. He simply focused on becoming the kind of leader he wished he had encountered on the worst day of his career. And Lily never forgot what happened either. Years later, when she was old enough to understand the full story, she asked her father, Daddy, were you scared when you lost your job? Daniel smiled. Yes. Then why didn't you give up? He looked at her and answered, because you were watching me. Lily hugged him. And Daniel realized that was the real victory. Not the promotion. Not the money. Not the revenge. It was showing his daughter that being knocked down does not mean you have to stay down.